And, so, and I apologize since you are our only person that there are some participatory questions. So I hope that you'll still participate. And I do hope maybe some other people will join us. Um, but yeah, we're not we're not the luckiest this evening. So I'm Jessamy Rahman-Klapper. I am a therapist with Pillars of Peace, and in general, I've been working in the field of survivors of gender-based violence, providing trauma therapy and psychoeducation and support, and also sometimes advocacy for the last now it would be about a little over 5 years. And prior to that, still working within human services with immigrant and refugee communities because I speak Arabic and French. And so that was something that was helpful in a lot of ways. So today's webinar is, like I mentioned before the recording started, it's about human trafficking a little bit generally, but we're focusing a little more on some aspects of human trafficking that may not be immediately apparent or well known to a lot of people, so that it's easier to identify when it might be happening to somebody that you know, or if you're a provider to a client that you're working with, even if it's not apparent to that person, because just as with other forms of abuse, it's very common for survivors not to actually know that this applies to what happened to them if they are a survivor of trafficking. So on that note, I just wanted to ask, when you hear about human trafficking or you think about human trafficking, what comes to mind and who comes to mind? And this is no judgment. It's what is kind of the first image or scenario that you think of. It doesn't mean that you aren't aware there are other scenarios, but the first thing that comes to mind is usually the thing that we've heard the most about.
So I mean, for me, I guess the image that pops up in my mind when I think of human trafficking is like human trafficking for purposes of like sex labor. Um, from I don't like the phrase like third world countries, but like from I know that it happens other places. I know that that was your preamble to the question, but
Right.
that's the image that pops up in my mind. And I took a class on Southeast Asian, like the history going back, like geishas and all of that. And so like I think that that's probably the image that is probably most prominent in my mind when I think human trafficking.
Right. A lot of people, the first thing that they think about with human trafficking, and the first thing that is really showcased in the media about human trafficking is specifically sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. And the second thing that it tends to be is focusing on, if we're talking about the US, we're talking about foreign born people or people who are being trafficked across borders, or maybe even, like you mentioned, sex trafficking in places where there's almost what's sometimes called the sex tourism industry, but it's usually involves some amount of trafficking as well. So come back to that, but I just wanted to share the UN definition of human trafficking. There are other definitions. The US federal law has its own legal definition, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And I'm not going to get into that because I want to kind of maintain this is not legal information or advice. But just that human trafficking is any recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. And men, women, and children of all ages and from all backgrounds can become victims of this crime, which occurs in every region of the world. So I'm going to get into some statistics, but something that I did not include are the fact that in the US, if we're talking about just I think both sex trafficking and labor trafficking in general, but perhaps most especially sex trafficking, the largest number of victims are not actually foreign born, although that receives a lot of attention and that people, they definitely deserve assistance and help. Um, there's quite a number of people who are exploited domestically, who are citizens of the US, and some things that can happen, particularly youth in the foster care system are vulnerable because of how much they are deprived of a stable and secure parent or caregiver in their lives. And also the criminalization that happens through the foster care system tends to make people very vulnerable to traffickers. And so people can get, young people can be recruited at a very early age. And it's not unusual for somebody who is a US citizen to not have any of their documentation, not know their own social security number because they've been trafficked and all of that stuff was taken away from them, or they were not, made privy to that information. So first, to just look at some general numbers, and these are global estimates from the International Labor Organization. They actually use figures on profits and other models to figure out. Oh, you can just speak.
It says the slide wasn't changing, so
Okay.
I just wanted to
Oh,
let you
I
know.
was wondering about that. Yes. Do let me know about that. Do you see the new slide now that says how many people are affected by human trafficking? Or
I do
still
not.
no?
I still see the
Okay.
title slide.
Oh, this is so annoying. Okay, I'm just going to, this is supposed to be this fancy presentation mode, but I'm just going to get out of that and do a regular full screen. And now let's see. Okay, so here's the definition, the UN definition. I'll just leave a little moment for the recording so that people can read that. Um, Okay, but so these next figures are from the International Labor Organization. It says they're estimates because they're not actually able to, go out and count exactly how many people are being trafficked for a variety of reasons, but they extrapolate based on figures around profits and just looking really in depth at various industries, and they're able to extrapolate that way, as well as by looking at actual reports that we do have of trafficking cases. So they estimate that globally, there are 49.6 million people in trafficking situations on any given day. They actually use the language of modern slavery, but I prefer to just refer to trafficking. And then 27.6 million of those are being exploited through forced labor, and 22 million are being exploited through forced marriage. And so both of those figures actually include both what we would call labor trafficking, even though forced sex is also a form of labor. Um, but this includes both of those types of trafficking. It's just whether this is happening through a form of employment or forced employment, or whether it's happening through forced marriage. And that's something that I like to highlight in particular because in the US, a lot of people are not familiar even with the concept of forced marriage, or they're not familiar with the fact that forced marriage is itself a form of human trafficking. So these are some of their big picture estimates, that 86% of forced labor cases happen in the private sector. That's not surprising, I think, to most people. Most of the time when you think of forced labor, people aren't thinking of government. However, it's important to recognize that governments are responsible for a significant portion of forced labor as well, whether we're talking about through prisons or some other form of forced labor. 14% of cases are state imposed. And then in this last section, we have a breakdown of those private sector cases. So 23% involve commercial sexual exploitation, and the other 63% are what US law would refer to just as labor trafficking. And so that's really significant because by far, labor trafficking is the more common form of trafficking, and yet we hear about it far less than we hear about commercial sexual exploitation. And so these next set of statistics are from the Polaris Project, and they're I gave a little bit of a disclaimer here because their statistics are based on hotline calls and reports. And we know that those are themselves skewed by people's ability to recognize that what's happening to them is human trafficking. So you can get a little bit of a feedback loop where if the media doesn't talk about labor trafficking being an issue, then fewer people who are experiencing labor trafficking are going to recognize that and report it and reach out for help. And fewer of those cases are going to get recorded. So the Polaris Project tends to overwhelmingly refer to cases of commercial sexual exploitation, but I don't consider that to be proof that labor trafficking is rare in the US. It's just that it does not get appropriate amount of attention. So even considering that the majority of their respondents are people reporting some form of sexual exploitation, 43% of the people reported being exploited by an employer. So employers are still a very big part of how trafficking happens in either category. After that, 26% are exploited by a family member or a caregiver. And then 22% are exploited by an intimate partner. And they also talk about the recruiters, because people obviously don't just go out and stumble into being trafficked, and they certainly don't go out and seek out being trafficked in some fashion. Usually there's somebody who's recruiting them, and the recruiters have a variety of tactics. The recruiter can seem just like a recruiter for any regular job, and then it just turns out that the job is one where you are not actually going to be paid, or you're going to be exploited in some way, or you're going to be doing something entirely other than what you thought you were going to be doing. And then there's another common form of recruitment, which is sometimes referred to as boyfriending, but it doesn't have to be a boyfriend. It could be just somebody who gains your trust by posing as somebody who cares about you, whether that's a boyfriend or a sort of like parental figure. Sometimes these things may be a little bit mixed, particularly when we're talking about young people being recruited. And so a lot of people will say that they were recruited by an intimate partner. Right. So 33% are actually recruited by a family member or caregiver. 28% are recruited by an intimate partner, and 22% are recruited by an employer. Anything jump out at you about these numbers or any of the previous slides that we were looking at? Anything that seems surprising, or even if you were familiar with it already, that kind of just stands out?
I guess I'm just I'll jump in and I'll just say that I'm just kind of sad at the how high a number, 33% seems pretty high to me, of for the number of people who are recruited by family members. Like those your comments earlier about children in foster care, children who may not have, or individuals who may not have, the most reliable or um protective caregivers in their lives, that makes sense, but I'm just kind of sad by that number, by how high that is.
Yeah, it's really disturbing, and it I I'm hoping that we'll have time toward the end to talk a little bit about prevention, because a lot of people think, and there are even organizations out there that are sort of promoting this idea of trafficking being something that happens with like a stranger, like pulling up in a car and kidnapping somebody, and that is extremely rare and unlikely. And a lot of what we need and what gets discouraged, and even like, for example, this sort of public conversation around the idea of grooming. Grooming is an actual term for normalizing and desensitizing somebody, especially a young person, um, to sexual behaviors in particular, so that they can be exploited either by that person or as part of actual commercial sexual exploitation. But it has been appropriated by individuals who actually are do not want children to have access to accurate information about like their development and their bodies and reproductive health and sexual health and things like this. And they're characterizing that as grooming, when in fact it is extremely important for and protective for individuals of any age to know how to name the parts of their body, to know what, to have something called body autonomy and things like that, so that they are less able to be exploited. Because we know that um, in cases of any type of abuse, a lot of the time the abuser is somebody who is trusted. It's a family member, it's a caregiver. And if it's not that, then it's somebody still who has a lot of authority and trust and power over the person. So um, it's just interesting how much there's a contrast between the public conversation around how people can get trafficked and how it actually happens to most people who, who are exploited in this way. And so this is a distinction too, to make that like um 26% saying that they were directly exploited and trafficked by a family member. Um, but then 33% are saying that they were recruited into trafficking by a family member or caregiver. And this is particularly disturbing too, because we're again talking about the Polaris Project numbers, which focuses a lot on commercial sexual exploitation. I think if you go into labor trafficking, this would actually be an even higher number. So I already asked this question. So now I want to sort of get into what we're talking about with the overlooked forms and overlapping abuse. So that's why we're not talking super in depth about human trafficking in general right now, because I just want to highlight some of the things that tend to be overlooked, and which we notice particular. I don't think that they're particular to Muslim diaspora communities, but they are present in our communities. And so it's important for us to talk about them and be aware of them. So some of those overlooked forms are, number one is forced marriage, which the International Labor Organization already recognizes as a major source of human trafficking globally. After that, we'll talk a little bit about labor trafficking in general. Even though this is recognized, it doesn't receive the same amount of media attention, and it actually accounts for a far greater number of or percentage and proportion of trafficking cases domestically and globally. And then involuntary servitude is something that a lot of people don't think of as human trafficking or just don't remember, but it is something that happens, and the victims are particularly vulnerable because this is usually somebody who's being trafficked alone. Maybe they're working for an individual or a family, but there's not a group of other people being trafficked with them. So there's no peers or other people that they can kind of check against whether what's happening to them is normal. And then I also want to talk a little bit about forms of abuse that tend to or can overlap with human trafficking, but we don't always think about it. So in-law abuse is one of those, elder abuse, and then domestic violence. That last one obviously makes sense if we're seeing that a lot of people are being trafficked by their partners, that domestic violence might often go hand in hand with that. So first, forced marriage. Why does forced marriage fall under human trafficking? What makes it human trafficking? There's something in human trafficking that talks about profit, and it's not immediately apparent that by forcing somebody to get married, you're making a profit off of that. Obviously, there are cases where there is a dowry or there's a bride price or there is an exchange of money or goods between families on the occasion of a marriage. But that is not the only thing that can make a forced marriage profitable or transactional. Usually, forced marriages happen because there is some benefit to the family. So why would I force my child into marriage if there's no benefit to me to doing so, right? There's usually some benefit, even if it's not actually a financial one. So sometimes it's an immigration status that some member of the family is going to either acquire status through that forced marriage, or the other family members are hoping that by marrying their usually often a daughter, by marrying their daughter or their child to this other person, that the whole family will be able to get immigration status in a desirable place or location. Sometimes it's more about social capital. This is a more powerful family. We want to be aligned and allied with them. And so it's not up to you, the child, it's not up to you, the potential spouse, to decide whether you want to get married because it's beneficial socially or politically for us to have a familial connection to this other family. And sometimes it's even the concept that there are family debts, like one family decides which family member is going to move to the West, and they all put money in to help that person get there. And then there's an expectation that that person's child who has US citizenship when they're of age, that they should be married to somebody in the home country, specifically from the extended family, as a way of sort of repaying that debt. Or it can be a more obvious debt or something that is not, again, not financial, but there's still the sense of there is a transaction happening. And if there was no sort of gain to the family, then they wouldn't be forcing the marriage. And then obviously, once the marriage happens, the person is forced into doing all the things that come along with that marriage, whether we're talking about intimacy with somebody that they never wanted to be intimate with, or just about domestic labor. But again, this is not domestic labor that they opted into, it has all been forced upon them. And just thinking about who is vulnerable to forced marriages, I just mentioned because of the transactional aspect, it's always going to be families where there is there's a disadvantage. Maybe there's poverty, maybe there's displacement, maybe there is some sort of stigma on the family generally, but that is what tends to push a lot of family to force um, individuals who are part of the family into marriages. And I do want to acknowledge that while that men can and are forced into marriages, particularly when it's something very normalized in a family's culture. And I say family culture because it's not usually that the entire culture is just a-okay with forced marriages, but there's often where there's one forced marriage in the family, you'll often find that there's been others, and that this is sort of understood that this is what happens in our family. This is what we have to deal with. And men can also be forced into those marriages because if it's about the family gaining from the marriage, then it can also happen that the man's family are expecting to benefit from the marriage and that they do not offer a choice to their son over whether he can enter into that marriage or not. However, because of patriarchy and overall power dynamics between genders, um, women and girls are overwhelmingly the victims of forced marriage. And it happens that even if both partners are forced into the marriage, maybe the exploitation of the partners after the marriage isn't equal, or you will find that it is more frequent that after that forced marriage happens, that the when domestic violence follows, that it is more often the male who would then be um, abusing his partner. I remember working with someone at one point who had a lot of forced marriage in her family. Like pretty much all the marriages in her family had been forced. And she was saying that in the later generations, like her generation and younger ones, the men seemed to feel that they couldn't rebel against the marriage itself, but they would then be very resentful of the partner that they had been forced to marry. And so they would kind of take it out on them or they would disrespect the marriage. But there was this feeling that even though they had relatively more power than the women in the same family, they still felt like they couldn't just turn down the marriage overall. Um, this is an interesting topic to go into in more detail, but I just want to address kind of generally what it looks like. So, any thoughts about why we don't often hear about forced marriage as a major form of human trafficking? Why that might be something that is discussed less often?
I'll jump in and say that I think maybe there's like what I wrote down was like forced marriage is not equal arranged marriage. Although forced marriages may be arranged, like not all arranged marriages are forced marriages. So I think that there may be one of the reasons potentially maybe like people not necessarily being able to break it apart from like if because people have arranged marriages all the time and both
Right.
parties are willing and consenting and they want to engage in that, they want to join in that union, and so like there may be pushback or resistance to identify something as a forced marriage because they're like, well, I don't know I don't know how that person really feels about it if they're not verbalizing that they're concerned about it. I think that that's probably a little bit harder to dissect because it happens like most domestic violence, so much in the home away from like the public eye, and like I don't really know what a person's thinking when they go to sleep at night.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's something that's a little hard for people to talk about with clarity. And actually, I did not include in this presentation just be for issues of time, but there are some really great visualizations of a continuum between both, love marriages and arranged marriages, of how you can start off with one or the other and what elements have to happen in order for that to become a forced marriage. Because like you said, you can have an arranged marriage that is fully between two fully consenting adults. You've just decided to go through this matchmaking process and go through your families, or whichever sort of social structure you're making use of, but that doesn't make it a forced marriage. And similarly, you can choose your partner, but there are things that can happen that can even make it so that you feel that you are not able to back out of that marriage, that there's somehow become force and shame, or some form of coercion has become involved, and then that marriage becomes forced. Um, I think the other reason why we don't hear about this as a major form of human trafficking is just because we have this very limited view of human trafficking in general. And so to get to the point of nuance of discussing forced marriage and understanding the difference between forced marriage and arranged marriage, it just becomes very complex. Oh, and Uzma has also said, because it may be culturally acceptable in some places, right? So there are areas or communities within which this has become very normalized. And so people do not want to talk about it as a form of trafficking, because this would sort of just disrupt in general that sort of social fabric. I've definitely worked with people who said that they didn't realize or think of their marriage as being forced because there was no concept that they ever had a choice to begin with. Like, they didn't even realize that this was something that they would have a choice about. So it never came to the point of them saying, I don't want to marry this person, and the family like threatening them or anything like that, because they had been raised to believe that they didn't even have a choice in the matter. And usually when that happens, is because that's also how their parents experience marriage. It's, the parents are not these sort of necessarily evil people who are trying to subject their children to something that never happened to them. It's often something that was familiar to their family.
Um, can I ask a quick question?
Mhm. Yes.
So with because we're talking about trafficking, and like, so the my question is, like, if there's a, just for like examples, like if there's a US citizen individual who
Mhm.
is forced or strongly encouraged to enter a union with somebody else, is that then, like, who's a non-US citizen who's coming into the United States, is that individual who's forced, is that US citizen individual who's forced into engaging in that marital contract considered a trafficking survivor or victim if they're not the ones that's like physically moving across borders?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So that's the other thing that I think is confusing too, because trafficking can involve moving across borders, but doesn't necessarily. So it might be that the partner who is moving across borders is not the one who is being trafficked, but rather the person who is being forced to marry them. And this is a scenario that I have seen either happen or be attempted in families here, where the idea is, like I said, that this family member somehow has an obligation to marry somebody else in order to confer status in the US on that person, and perhaps also the extended family of that person. We'll move on just because there's a lot to cover. I'm not going to really, I'm skimming over labor trafficking because it's just so huge. But I do want to talk about it. So first is that it covers all forms of labor, and many forms of labor, there is somebody involved in trafficking. There's been some really interesting investigative reporting recently on how like those scam calls and scam like chats that we get are often from people who are being trafficked in these sort of shady call centers to do that. That is trafficking. There are agricultural workers, are widely known. A lot of agricultural workers are trafficked, domestic workers, but it happens in pretty much any industry that you can think of. There is some amount of labor trafficking. It's present in every country, every economy in the world, um, and there's also an interesting, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term multi-level marketing scheme, but this is, what we often refer to as a pyramid scheme, and it covers everything from like Herbalife and Mary Kay and what was that legging company? I forget the name of it, but
That, is it Lululemon or no?
I keep wanting to say that, but it's not them. They're a regular company. It's the one that had all these like crazy prints, but they were, very famously um, not only a multi-level marketing scheme, but they really ended up facing some consequences for the level of bad business practices that they were engaging in. But um, any thoughts about why pyramid schemes or multi-level marketing uh, businesses might have a trafficking connection? Especially
I
if our newcomers want to, like, and I'm happy to hear from you too, but I'm just saying.
well, I was just gonna say, I crime. Like if you want to encourage or entice somebody to do something that may not be 100% on the up and up, then you know exploiting you know their desire to have citizenship status, holding on to vital documents, using other exploitive forms of violence is a good incentive um out to get somebody to join in mass about that. I mean, that's the only thing that came to mind.
Yeah, so it makes sense that labor trafficking in general is so prominent because um, livelihood in general is tied to labor in most of the world, I think, to some extent, maybe less in some of the countries with a more successful social fabric, but even then, maybe your livelihood is tied to your citizenship status. And so if you don't have citizenship, then getting some form of status through labor, all of these things become something that it can be used to exploit you. I mentioned the multi-level marketing schemes because a lot of these businesses are legal. Mary Kay is a multi-level marketing scheme. It is around. It's considered legal. Um, many other of these businesses are around and are considered legal, but they all have an exploitative core because the way that they function is to have one person recruit more people who then are under that person, and they profit off of the fact that they have recruited a certain number of people, even though what they're doing every time they recruit some more people is that they are actually like creating more competition within the market. And so what ends up happening in a lot of these structures is that you are profiting off of creating debt for the people who are below the pyramid or at the lower level than you. So for the example of Mary Kay and the legging company that I can't remember the name of, um, you would recruit some people, and then because you recruited those people, they would have to buy a bunch of inventory that they would then have to sell. But now they're like in debt to the company until they sell that inventory. And so there's this sort of constant relationship of debt, and debt is a big part of how a lot of labor trafficking works, where um, people will say, oh yeah, sure, like you have a job, but you know, we have to charge you this much for your food and this much for your board and this much for the supplies and this much for that, until in fact like you owe the person money, more and more money the more you work, and so you never actually get paid and you never earn anything. And in multi-level marketing schemes, it's less obvious than that, but oftentimes there's a similar rubric at play. And the legging company, part of the scandal was that people weren't allowed to choose what inventory they would buy, so they would just get saddled with really random things that they couldn't sell. And the only solution that they were being given by the higher ups was to just buy more inventory. So they were pressuring people to put themselves more and more and more into debt with the company. Um, and so ultimately they were being exploited. Um, but I think it's interesting that this business model is legal and accepted in the US in particular, because it sort of normalizes this exploitive model of labor in general, so that things have to get really extreme before we recognize it as, oh yes, LuLaRoe, that's them. I knew it was Lou something, but it wasn't Lululemon. LuLaRoe, yes. um, yes, read about them, and it's very interesting. And they use very similar tactics. If you study human trafficking at all, labor trafficking at all, and then you look at how not just LuLaRoe, but other multi-level marketing schemes recruit people, even how they sell their products, it's very, very similar tactics. And so this, I think, is just maybe also part of why we hear so much more about sex trafficking than labor trafficking, is because there's an extent to which exploiting workers is normalized in our society. And so um, it ends up, you know, making it very narrow, the window for which where we're like, okay, that's really labor trafficking, because there's a lot of stuff that's really exploitative that happens, but which our system um, just doesn't recognize as a crime. So involuntary servitude is another one of these things that is a little bit less, gets less attention. And this is forced labor for an individual or group of individuals. It's not a business. So this isn't something where people are necessarily profiting off of your labor in a way where there's money going into their pocket, but it's labor that should be paid. So it's often ends up being domestic labor. So you might hear of domestic servitude used similarly, but it could be other tasks as well, like driving, gardening, etc. It can show up in a lot of different ways, but one is we mentioned, you know, being trafficked or exploited by family members. And so one way that I have seen this happen a lot is with the trafficker exploiting family or communal traditions of taking in a poor family or community member. Often there's some promise that they're going to take care of that person, or that they're going to elevate them somehow by taking them in, or maybe there just isn't somebody else to take care of them, and they offer to take care of this person, but then that person is forced into servitude for the family. So they may be a child at the time that this happens as well. So there can be an element of child trafficking or child labor happening, but it can also be someone who is an adult. Um, and then basically they are kept isolated from other people, and they are forced to just essentially work as a free servant for this individual or family, whatever it was. Um, And oftentimes the promised benefit isn't there at all, but if it is, then it's used as a reason for, oh, this is why you need to pay us back. Like school fees are very expensive, so you need to go out, selling things for us in the market. That would also be a form of, well, actually, that would be labor trafficking, the selling things in the market. But it could just be, you need to take care of the house, you need to do all the cooking, you need to do all the cleaning, you need to take care of all the young children or babies in the home because um, it's costing us a lot to take care of you. Sometimes this is the language that happens. Are there any particular scenarios that you can think of where this might happen, or do you remember any media representation or famous cases of involuntary servitude?
I'm just thinking of Cinderella. I mean, but I was like, because I was like, well, I guess that was what
Yes,
she experienced.
yeah, yes, that was involuntary servitude. She was forced to perform constant domestic labor without any compensation and also without any consent, right? Like she didn't decide which tasks she wanted to do or when she wanted to do them, and it was not divided up equally between her and other family members. It was literally that she was forced into servitude for the evil stepmother and sisters. Um, there was a case a while ago, I think, and I should have looked it up to get the specifics of, but it's another example. It was an ambassador's family, I believe, that had a young woman, and maybe she was a minor or she was a minor at the time she first started living and working for them, but she, I think, escaped or ran away, and she had been, being in involuntary servitude with this family for years, and they had just sort of brought her along. And that's an interesting thing that can happen as well, where, which I have also seen, where the trafficking started in one place, and as the family travels they continue to bring this person with them to different locations. So they're going through whatever legal processes they need to do in order to make that happen, but they continue to depend on that person's forced labor the whole time. And that also is a way that people will bring up, like, oh, we've taken you so many places you would have never been without us. It's another way of kind of making it seem as if they're doing this person a favor when in fact they're exploiting them. Another thing that will connect to one of the forms of abuse we talk about later is that it can show up as something that happens after marriage, whether it's forced or arranged or by choice um, or completely, like happy love marriage. Sometimes after the fact, there is some element of involuntary servitude. But I think it does happen more often when there's a forced marriage and there's already this transactional nature to it, where because sometimes that is the benefit that the family is looking to gain. The family that is gaining the spouse, they're looking to gain that free labor of the new spouse, and they are expecting that that's what that person is going to do for them, to basically serve as a free domestic labor for everybody else in the home. So now just want to open up to everyone who's attending. What might trafficking look like when it presents alongside any of the forms of abuse listed below? So I just mentioned in-law abuse briefly. Um, we can talk more about that too, but domestic violence, elder abuse, and child abuse. And anyone can respond, and you can respond in the chat if you don't feel up to speaking out loud.
I'll just say generally, in my experience, the domestic violence boils down to just the power and control imbalance in a relationship. I'd imagine that trafficking might look like somebody coming to appointments with somebody or not allowing them to speak on their own or listening into conversations. When they're trying to meet with service providers for other benefits, like if somebody's going for, SNAP benefits and they're trying to do the application with the case manager and somebody's, waiting there watching them. And then, isolation from other support networks if they're not already isolated, withdrawal from, activities that they normally would want to engage in or, communities that they would normally be connected to.
Yeah, in general, all forms of abuse involve a dynamic of power and control. And so you're likely to see those tactics across the board with any of the forms of abuse that we're talking about, and including any form of human trafficking. I also like to just think about which types of trafficking tend to happen. In each scenario, although obviously there can be outliers as well. And I think I listed some of these here. So when we're talking about domestic violence, it can be financial abuse. It could be forced labor in that intimate partner or spouse's business. I've seen that happen where there's a family business, but the victim is not actually benefiting from that family business in any way. Their name is not on it. They're not receiving benefits from it, but they are forced to labor away at that business, even at times when maybe other people are on break or vacation or something. I've also seen very commonly that the domestic servitude or involuntary servitude could happen alongside of domestic violence. And sadly, forms of commercial sexual exploitation can also happen alongside of domestic violence. And even I've seen cases where custody was and child visits were used to exploit a partner. In this case, the mother did not win custody of the children, did not win primary custody. And so in order to have visits with her children, the abuser would insist that she be intimate with him. And so that would also be considered a form of trafficking, because of the element of force and coercion involved in that. In-law abuse, I mentioned a little bit. We talk about in-law abuse sometimes just because obviously it's not always in-laws, it could be other family members, but the point is that this is a form of abuse where it's not necessarily the partner themselves. The partner may or may not be a participant to the abuse. They may be passive, they may be enabling, they may even be trying to resist it to some degree, but usually what's different about in-law abuse is that there's this sense that the spouse is the property of that whole family, and that they're sort of in charge of that person. So again, you would see things like domestic servitude or involuntary servitude, forced labor in a family business, or you may even see the person working and a job, but then their wages would be taken away by that family member. And just other forms of financial abuse might be happening at the same time. With elder abuse, something that it's not the only thing that can happen to elders, but something that is perhaps specific in terms of trafficking scenarios, it would be a form of involuntary servitude where, say, people bring over an elder relative from maybe a home country, um, with the intention to have that person provide some form of domestic labor in the home, whether that's caring for their child or doing some kind of other labor in the home. Um, and instead, again, of that just being part of each family member contributing to the family, this person is really treated as if they're just a servant, as if they need to repay the family for their presence there. And in particular, these elements of elder abuse come in, which are similar to how people with disabilities can be exploited as well, where you're being coerced in turn for needed care and support. So, oh, because I took you to your doctor's appointment, then you need to do all this work for me, um, to kind of pay me back. Or it could again be attached to some type of immigration status pressure. And then finally, with child abuse, any type of, making a child work and then you gaining profit from that they're not old enough to consent to. There's some questions around that. And any child engaging in any form of sex work, even if the child says that they're consenting, they're not old enough to consent. And so they're considered a victim of trafficking off the bat. But it's also important to note that children can also be exploited in family businesses, and they can also be exploited as part of in a form of domestic servitude. Now, obviously, this is another thing that gets complicated because we actually have laws on the books that allow for children, particularly for children to work in family businesses and to be considered employees of those family businesses, and also at a younger age than they would be allowed to work in the general labor marketplace. And we also have relaxed rules around children working on a family farm. They're allowed to start at an even younger age, and I believe be listed as employees. Um, this gets this is another area where I think sometimes the desire to be understanding of children participating in a family business perhaps also normalizes and kind of sets the seeds for it being possible and easy to exploit a child. Um, we know that a lot of identity fraud even happens with parents exploiting their children's um, kind of clean slate of credit and so on. Um, and so a parent who is unscrupulous or just doesn't is kind of desperate and doesn't know any better can equally exploit a child in these ways by um, forcing them to, work longer than they really should, or doing harder labor than a child should, or doing unsafe things, and they're definitely not getting like a paycheck from that family business, even though they might be listed as an employee of some type. So these are some things to look out for. I'm not saying that all children that work or are helping out in a family business are being trafficked. That's not it at all. But I'm saying that family businesses are sometimes, it's easy for them to fly under the radar of trafficking when that is in fact what's happening there, because there is this veneer of, oh, it's normal. We're just all together helping the family business, but it can obviously cross a line. So briefly, here's some resources that you might reach out to if you or someone that you know is dealing with trafficking or suspect is dealing with trafficking. In the case of forced marriage, this is often that people are attempting to force that person to be married. So we would like to help that person prevent that from happening sooner. So you can reach out to obviously us at Pillars of Peace for support. But the New York City Family Justice Centers are a great resource that work with survivors of many different types of gender-based violence, human trafficking being one of them. So you would call 311 to be connected to your nearest center, or you would just, look up and see where's the one for your borough. This number here is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So you can reach out to that either because you are reaching out for help for yourself, or you can ask for information if there's a situation that you're unsure of, or there's a person that you think needs help. And then this last number is helpful for people who are, unfortunately, this is just for US citizens and permanent residents abroad. Resources vary wildly from country to country when we're talking about residents of those countries. But if you're a US citizen or permanent resident and you are facing abuse abroad, or you're perhaps at risk of a forced marriage or FGM or female genital mutilation or cutting, this is a number that you can reach out to, or email, or that you can reach out to for help being evacuated from that place. They would be working with the US Embassy usually, so you could also just reach out to the embassy, but sometimes it's helpful to talk to an agency first that is just familiar with how to do this type of thing. Just need a minute to anyone wants to grab a screenshot of that. So sort of as a final question, food for thought, given what we've discussed about different forms of human trafficking, where they show up, who is involved, who the most common exploiters and recruiters are, what should prevention look like? What do you think would be the most helpful or effective ways to prevent people from being trafficked? Avoid this. Go ahead.
um I mean, I think one thing that could happen is like more media portrayals of it, because I mean, I my instinct is to say education, but not everybody attends trainings like this or
Yeah.
it works in this field. And so if you see it on television or your favorite show, I think ABC had done an episode of Station 19 relatively recently where they had I guess I didn't necessarily identify it as trafficking at that time, but it is it falls into the categories of trafficking. And then I think that there was also an episode of Grey's Anatomy. I think the more that you see depictions of it in the media, the more that you're able to pick up on it in your own life. And I know working with, survivors who may or may not have been trafficked, and I'm now reconceptualizing certain situations where I'm like, that probably was a forced labor situation. Where I had like spoken with the clients where they're like, I didn't even recognize that this was abuse or anything like that, because nobody I'm living in a household with my family members, and they're used to this. They're not saying that it's right, but they're not saying that it's something that I can go to the police for. And it was only when a coworker had said, that's not okay, NYPD will do something about it. that they actually reached out for services. So I think that the more education that we have, or the more that we kind of put that into the public mind, the more we can try to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Having more and more accurate and more varied media portrayals can make a huge difference. Uzma, go ahead.
Hi, Jessamy. Thank you. Naomi, I agree with you on media portrayal. And also, last week I was at a bathroom and there was a signage which said, are you being human trafficked? If you are, feel free to call this number. So I think resources like, at places where people go to, more often and have privacy too. So
Mhm.
where they know no one is watching them, and for them to get that number or the website that's there for them to reach out. Because I think a lot of these people, again, they're always being watched or someone's always around them. So they don't have the access. So I guess more information of like, hotlines and resources available for people would greatly help.
That's a great point. And that is actually a really nice um campaign that I think only started like maybe in the last 10 years, 5 years, something like that, of actually making sure that more bathrooms have these signs. And I think there's a campaign as well around hotels, making sure that hotels have this information available somewhere, just displayed generally, so that people can't feel like they're being targeted, but it's just around, and that information is there. Um, Anything else that's coming to mind of how trafficking could be made less common, or could be prevented? Perhaps structural changes.
Well, I mean, the foster care system is obviously has a lot of different issues. I I hate to keep going back to television, but it's oftentimes how I process information. Um, but like there's a very popular show on Netflix, Ginny and Georgia, where the mom went through her child number one's credit using their social security number and then jumped to child number two. Um, and again, wasn't identified as trafficking, identified as horrible, but not identified as a trafficking situation. But I think there could be, I could imagine, legislation or regulations surrounding, you know, the use of somebody's social security number, before a certain age or things like that, that might be able to structurally stop some of the financial abuse, at least in that situation.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm also thinking of like when you mentioned the foster care system, there are a lot of things about the foster care system that make the youth even more vulnerable to being trafficked, beyond just the fact that there's this instability at play. And one of them is the legal involvement. For example, there's some extent to which foster youth who simply run away from a placement are get criminalized for that, and they basically are brought into the judicial system and the criminal justice system, and are given a juvenile record anyway, very early on, for things that if it had happened outside of the foster care system, it would not have been considered a criminal matter. And we know that people that have any type of criminal justice involvement are at an increased risk of trafficking. It makes sense that anytime you diminish somebody's access to resources, to employment, to social networks and social capital, you make them more vulnerable to exploitation. And so this is something that we see in the foster care system, and also broadly in general, like a society where a lot of people are vulnerable. a lot of the time either financially vulnerable or vulnerable in other ways. Those people are going to be vulnerable to exploitation. It's interesting that in the US, healthcare is dependent upon employers. So that's a pretty huge thing to make people afraid to leave or lose a job, even if they realize that they're starting to be exploited. And that's the other piece that I didn't talk about much. And I think that gets into sort of more technical and maybe legal things that we should have another training on with another, with an expert of a different kind. But oftentimes when we think about trafficking, we think that somebody's just not getting paid at all, or they're not getting any money, and that's not necessarily true. You could be still earning something and you are still being trafficked, because it's about this element of force, fraud, and coercion, and just also about the extent to which you are being exploited by that employer or person or business. Well, thank you all for joining us, even on this, horrible weather evening. And while there's so many other things going on, I really appreciate it. I hope that you will, join future events for Pillars of Peace as well. I have a feedback form that I'm going to share in the chat if you have time. This is not just to give us your feedback on this presentation, but also to let us know if there are other things that you would be interested in having from Pillars of Peace. And I'll also say that something I'm considering doing, if there's enough interest in it, is having sort of a lunch hour drop-in grounding mindfulness session for maybe just half an hour. So if you get the chance to fill out this form, you can also let me know if that is of interest to you. And 1 second while I get that link. I really appreciate it if you do get the chance to fill that out. If you don't, I understand. We all have things to do. But thank you so much for joining us this evening and for participating, even though it's a small group. I know that can sometimes feel intimidating. And hopefully I'll see you at our next webinar.